Nice to see everyone.
Evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Andy Haldane. I'm the Chief Executive here at the RSA. And let me just extend a huge welcome to you all here to RSA House, and to all those that are also watching online for tonight's really special event. Just over a year ago, we at the RSA were incredibly lucky to collaborate with the Ukrainian Institute in London, Alicia in particular. Where is Alicia? Over there, stood up. To host an amazing event with a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winner, Alexandra Matvichuk. And it was a really heart-wrenching, but also a real privilege for us to hear from her in her role as head of the Center for Civil Liberties, working tirelessly to document the war crimes and human rights violations perpetrated in Russia's war against Ukraine. Sadly, another year of war has now passed. And then, as now, we at the RSA, as staff and as fellows, remain absolutely resolute in our support and solidarity with our friends in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, is still having to confront not just untold human suffering, but the mass destruction of infrastructure and the catastrophic damage to the environment as well. And that means the need to secure peace, justice, and recovery, and to move towards a more positive future for the people of Ukraine, is even more urgent now than it ever has been previously. As RSA Fellows in the room will know, this year, which is the 270th anniversary of the RSA, happy birthday to us. We are 270 years, thank you. I haven't been here the whole time. And we've chosen for our theme for the year, the theme of courage through our public talks and our public events. And that seems particularly apt as a theme this evening. It's a huge honor for us to be collaborating again with the Ukrainian Institute team to bring together a fantastic panel of speakers, all of whom are working with such courage and such commitment in their respective fields to make that process of justice and regeneration possible in Ukraine. Before we hear from them, and I can't wait to hear from them, I did though want to pay tribute to a wider group of people who've supported this evening's event, and indeed made tonight's event possible. And that's the delegation of Flanders in the UK and Ireland. It's the Finnish Institute in UK and Ireland. It's the Cyprus High Commission. It's the Culture of Solidarity Fund and the European Union National Institutes for Culture in London. A huge thanks to all of them for their support for this evening and indeed beyond this evening. And with that, it just remains for me to say it's a great pleasure to hand across to the person in charge this evening, Sasha, editor of the London Ukrainian Review, to tell you more about tonight's discussion, introduce our speakers. Thanks everyone again for coming. I hope you enjoy the evening. And Sasha, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone in this room, and thank you to the RSA. It's a huge privilege and inspiration for us to partner with such an institution with such a strong commitment to social change, to regenerative futures, which we also hope to reach while exercising this radical courage that you spoke about, Andy. For the Ukrainian Institute London, it's a very important event, and we thank all our partners for supporting us and for bringing this excellent panel of speakers. to discuss a very urgent topic, global environmental challenges, lessons from Ukraine. Today I'm joined by an absolutely fantastic array of speakers. Next to me is Anna Ackerman. She is a climate and energy professional, a founding member of Center for Environmental Initiatives Eco Action in Ukraine, where she worked as head of the climate department and currently serves as a board member. She is also a policy analyst at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, working on green reconstruction of Ukraine. Thank you for coming, Anna. Mariuka Parvari is an environmental expert at the European Commission's Ukraine Service under the Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. She has over 20 years of experience working on for the third sector, central government and research institutions, and she focuses especially on environmental issues in Eastern Europe, specializing in environmental policy, environmental impact assessment, and water management. Jojo Mehta is the co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide, coordinating between legal developments, diplomatic traction, and public narrative in the effort to establish ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. Jojo has contributed to UN conferences, diplomatic events, law and business summits, as well as publications and broadcasters such as Time Magazine, the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, and much more. Bart Gruyert is project director at Neo-Eco Ukraine. Currently, he works on developing international business ties, as well as restoring Ukraine's ecology through circular economy, designed and developed by Neo-Eco Ukraine. I'm very excited to hear more from our distinguished panel, but I hope you will bear with me for a few opening remarks. Since 2014, Russia has waged its war not only against the people of Ukraine, but also against environment in our country. In 2022, its crimes only escalated. Ukrainian NGO Eco Action, whose representative we are lucky to have here today, has recorded 1,500 cases of environmental damage from Russian war. I will give you 3 examples just to make it more real for all of us. The first one is mines. During my field trips to northern and eastern regions of Ukraine, which were occupied by Russia early in 2022 and then liberated by the Ukrainian army, I'm very conscious not to step outside the asphalted paths. Why? Because these areas in Ukraine are heavily mined with anti-personnel landmines, as well as other explosives. 1/3 of Ukrainian territory, which is something like the territory of Austria and Hungary combined, has become a minefield. It's the largest minefield in the world. And this is one of the problems for us to solve in the coming decades. My second example relates to the destruction of the dams in Ukraine. You might remember that in June 2023, on the 6th of June, Russia blew up the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine, flooding around 80 settlements, endangering around 16,000 people. The number of casualties is still unknown because this area is under Russian occupation. It's needless to say that the damage from the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam was felt beyond Ukraine because water containing toxins was flushed into the Black Sea. How have we, as a global community, responded to this crime? Well, the answer is that last week, Russia bombed Dnipro-HES, the Dnipro hydroelectric power plant, and dam in Zaporizhia, my hometown in southeastern Ukraine. I would say that our response was insufficient to deter Russia in the escalation of its crimes. And my third example relates to nuclear blackmail. You may also know that early in March 2022, Russia occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant just down the stream of the Dnieper River from Dnipro that was bombed last week. For 2 years, it remained militarized. And last week, during the bombings of Ukraine, it was cut off the grid yet again, and the station was put at risk of blackout. So what have we done again as a global community to prevent the escalation of these crimes, to demilitarize the first site of civilian nuclear infrastructure that was used for military aims? While we are pondering these grave questions, I would also like our discussion tonight to focus on recovery and on justice, on holding the criminals accountable. But before we start, I would like to ask Anna to help us understand, as a person who is really an expert in what is going on in Ukrainian environmental scene. Could you please explain to us the extent of the damage that has been caused by Russia's war?
Thank you, Sasha. And thank you very much to all of you for coming here. I think on the third year of the full-scale war, it's precious to have people still, listening. And today's topic is also special. And as you will see, and I think it's important that we're talking about global challenges, not only Ukraine, because what's happening in Ukraine actually is teaching us a lot, and hopefully will also give us a lot of new tools and mechanisms, and international ones too, to actually deal with many issues. Another important thing that I would want to mention is that I see this more and more, that, Ukraine is quite a large country, the largest country in Europe. However, how many people are we now? I never know anymore the numbers, maybe 14 million, let's rely on something around that. But we are, in the end, not many, because we have 1 million people in the army, and actually the extent of the challenges is enormous. And I think I'm myself being struck every single day when I see how many tanks have been destroyed, how many personnel, and so on. And we're talking about, tens of tanks every day. Imagine the scale. Sasha mentioned the mining, and of course the mining in Ukraine that also is happening today is also on a huge scale. I'll give you just one number. I don't want to be overflowing you with numbers, but the recent report by the World Bank says that to rebuild Ukraine, to have the economic recovery and reconstruction, it would cost $500 billion US. And I was trying to think, how to actually grasp this number. What is this $500 billion? And if we want to build the country also better, well, $500 billion is also a number, so it's a sum that the EU dedicated to implement the European Green Deal in the coming years for the whole of EU. We are talking about rebuilding Ukraine. And honestly, and I'm sure that today's speakers too will confirm, we will never be able to do this ourselves. This is why we rely heavily on international help, support all the time. And plus, Ukraine, of course, does not just need the military help. This is the number one issue. But also, our budget is lacking money, so it's just cover all of the basic social support, education, healthcare, and so on. So we are in a situation where we have to keep the economy running, at the same time fighting. And I think Ukrainian resilience and Ukrainians are fantastic. I've been myself now inspired by Ukrainians every single day, by everything they do. And I think they're just incredible. So I will try to draw kind of a few lines here, because we are talking about environmental damages. Myself, I'm a power engineer by education. And I kind of recently, we have this digital app where, we have our passports in the smartphone. We are very proud of that. And we recently had also in this app our education degrees uploaded. So I have now kind of, again, I see my master's degree, which says thermal power plants. I graduated in 2012, 2012 at Kyiv Polytechnical Institute, and my professors were incredible. They were basically people who were building Ukrainian power system. And they were very proudly saying, we built the dams, we built the nuclear power plants and the thermal power plants, and now they see them being destroyed. So just a few days ago, the Kharkiv thermal power plant was destroyed. I would say completely, because although some say it would take years to rebuild it, I think we have to understand that it will not be rebuilt. Because the way actually Ukraine will be designing its new energy system would be different. This was a power plant that was built in the 70s. It was running on gas, on oil. Now it will be something different. So that's why the conversation about the damages to the environment and to climate, and then the reconstruction, it all comes together kind of under one big cupola. We, together with the colleagues from EcoAction, we have been recording the monitoring, let's say, damages to the environment, and indeed it's hundreds, so of different types. Of course, when the thermal power plant is being shelled, it's one type of the damage to the environment, one type of pollution. When we are talking about the Kakhovka Dam destruction, it's whole ecosystems that were destroyed, and so on. And I think it's important to mark out the Kakhovka Dam. Always remember and not forget, because this was an enormous type of damage that was, with one single blow-up that affected actually not just Ukraine, but many neighboring countries. There was pollution from, the chemical plants that were all along the river that ended up in the Black Sea, so that the algae bloom started in Turkey, in Romania, in all of the countries nearby, in the nearby regions, plus the mines that also ended up in the Black Sea. It affects everyone. But it's not just about that. And if you keep in mind the Kakhovka Dam, for now, and Jojo would be the person who would talk more about this today, I guess, but for now, in the international legal field, there is the Rome Statute that is often referred to, and there is only one reference to environment in relation to war crimes, and it criminalizes, and I read, intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. This is exactly what happened with the Kakhovka Dam. And this is why things like ecocide are important, but I will not be going into details now. But to actually prove that anything is an ecocide or is an environmental crime is actually very complicated. It takes decades. And to hold Russia accountable, or anybody else accountable who takes this sort of decisions to affect this damage, it takes a very long time. And hopefully this international community will be able to make sure that we hold the aggressors accountable. There are many things that happen in Ukraine, such as environmental crimes, but also other types of issues that we are facing that make me think, are we globally, do we have enough tools and mechanisms to actually be dealing with this sort of different challenges? Another type of issues that we are raising also with colleagues is climate impacts of the war, climate impacts of the military. It's not only in Ukraine that we have a war that is going on, it's also taking place in many other places around the world, and also militaries, exist, and they do, exercises and so on, but actually these emissions are nowhere to be found. That means that who is responsible? Because climate, as you know, climate change is something that affects us all. So Ukraine is trying to raise the voice on the international stage also to be talking about this kind of things. And finally, and the last thing is, of course, about how Russia's full-scale invasion showed how climate and energy security are integrally, bound to our everyday lives. This war being financed by Russian fossil fuel exports abroad, and it's still the case, unfortunately. There are sanctions that are working partially, but Russia found the loopholes and basically reselling through third countries, There are oil and gas and coal and so on, and we still keep buying it. This should not continue. But this is this direct link to fossil fuels, energy security, and the climate again. Fossil fuels, are impacting our lives every single day. And with that, I think that these are kind of the most important things, but also when we started calculating the climate impact of the war, we actually saw that lots of greenhouse gas emissions that are connected to this war are the future emissions from Ukraine reconstruction. Because to rebuild the country, it takes enormous energy, energy, water resources, and so on. And so you start questioning, how do you actually rebuild greener? And we have to be talking about other approaches to rebuilding the country. And I hope we'll discuss some of them today, too.
Thank you so much, Anna. You preempted my follow-up questions to you about this third issue under the cupola of problems that we face, which is fossil fuels and trade in fossil fuels feeding the militarization of Russian economy. But I would like to return to you when we talk more about reconstruction. I would like now to turn to Marjuka and tap into the particular area of your expertise, which is water management. Dams and water have been in the spotlight of today's discussion so far, and also of the coverage of environmental damage brought by the war in Ukraine. So I would like to ask you to explain the particular impact on marine ecosystems that this war has brought.
Thank you, Sasha, and good evening, everyone. It is my great honor and pleasure to be here today. And I want to start by saying that Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is raising a huge amount of concern, compassion, and sadness in my home country, Finland, also due to our history and the Second World War, where we faced a somewhat similar situation with the Soviet Union. So our thoughts are with Ukraine really every day, and we will stand by Ukraine, whatever it will take. But coming to Kakhovka, and which is one of the worst really, and water pollution in general. So of course, Kakhovka stands as the most significant single event in the whole sort of environmental history of full-scale war. It is a very far-reaching environmental disaster, and as you said, it goes well beyond Ukraine's borders, and it has been even called the worst environmental disaster in Ukraine since Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. So that tells a lot. So with the breach of the dam, hundreds of square kilometers of land were flooded, and thousands of square kilometers upstream were desiccated. Those were reservoirs and wetlands which were underwater before. And there was also damage upstream, but downstream it was maybe the worst, because these high velocity floods, they literally washed away entire biotypes and plants and animals. And for example, tens of thousands of birds and wild animals were impacted or perished by the breach of the dam. And it had a devastating impact on 75 internationally recognized protected areas. And as Anna already told, there were also storages of chemicals in the flood zone. And this led to the release of chemical pollutants, which included, for example, machine oil and liquid fertilizers. And all of these chemicals, together with huge nutrient and suspended solids load, which means all the particulates that were flushed from land, they all ended in the Black Sea, which Ukraine shares with 5 other riparian countries. So, and there, as we heard, the high pollution load has significantly impacted water quality. But in addition to Kakhovka, which is, of course, the most well-known event, every single Russian missile attack hitting, for example, chemical or mining industries, where there is a lot in Ukraine, it's a very industrialized country, or mining waste reservoirs, many exist in Ukraine, large farms or waste and wastewater facilities, they all impact Ukrainian watercourses. And also the movement, because people have been internally displaced, they were forced to move from the eastern parts of Ukraine to other places where they were too close to the front line. And when these people move to, say, Western Ukrainian cities, waste and wastewater systems become overloaded in those cities. And this is again causing pollution, which then ends up in watercourses. And these watercourses are interconnected not only with the Black Sea, but with like many major European water bodies. And for example, Lviv region, the pollutants from there, they flow all the way to the Baltic Sea, which is already very overburdened by nutrients and chemicals. So in that sense, we're all victims of Russia's crimes. Even on the Finnish shores of the Baltic Sea, we feel the impact.
Thank you so much, Mariuka. And I can confirm that in Lviv, there is no such concept as tap water. You can only drink bottled water because the water is so polluted, unfortunately. And you have really clarified for us the international impact of the destruction of dams and pollution of water in Ukraine. I'm really curious about the international response. Could you tell us a bit more about that? How has the international community reacted to this?
Well, Ukraine turned to the Finnish government, the Ukrainian government, a little over 1 year ago, and asking for help in sort of gathering evidence of these war crimes, including also water pollution. And not only Finland, but also several other countries and the European Union are now helping Ukraine in this evidence gathering, because it of course will be decisive what methods and how reliable this data is, because it has to hold up in international court one day so that we can use it. So it's a very important thing to support Ukraine in this, also these scientific and methodological issues. Because unfortunately now some of the methods that are used in Ukraine are based on the Soviet calculation systems, which are not really up to modern standards.
Thank you, and thank you for throwing this bridge to Giorgio. We have been talking about the documentation of these crimes, and now it is time to talk about ecocide, because the damage to the environment in Ukraine has been branded as such. And Giorgio, you are the CEO, co-founder of Stop Ecocide International. There's literally no better person in the world who could explain to us what ecocide is and what the case of Ukraine does to advance the recognition of ecocide as the international crime in the International Criminal Court.
Thank you so much. Our organization is global. We're an advocacy organization, and we have this one very specific goal, which is the criminalization of the worst harms to nature. And that's what we mean when we talk about ecocide. And that term now is becoming much more, sort of currency in the media, in academic and legal discussion, and of course in politics as well, to describe the worst harms. And just to give a very sort of brief rationale as to why this is important, there is plenty of environmental regulation and law around the world. But what we have seen very clearly, over recent decades, as this body of law has grown up, is that it still doesn't have the kind of enforceability. It's not adequate to the task of the levels of destruction that we are seeing. And of course, the environmental destruction in Ukraine, so in the context of armed conflict, is one of the key examples of where this happens. But it does, of course, also happen during peacetime, and in many parts of the world, it doesn't require a conflict to happen. But what we're seeing is that the enforceability is low, the monitoring is low, people don't follow those regulations. And what we would say this speaks to is a very profound cultural issue. which is that our sort of global economic system has grown up, around a sense of separation from and in a sense alienation from the very ecosystems that support life and that support us. And of course they've grown up over centuries, and perhaps where those ideas originated, that kind of sort of deep dualism goes way back, centuries old, and we see it in the Catholic Church, the spirit versus the body. We see it also in the Enlightenment with reason versus emotion, with reason versus nature, and so on. And so what we're seeing is a situation where humankind is seen as able to dispose of nature as we please. And to treat nature as an infinite bank of resources. Of course, we all know intellectually that is not the case. But cultural change takes a lot more time than the intellectual realization. So we already have this system in place. And if there's one area where this can be kind of intervened with in a positive way, it is law. And criminal law in particular has a kind of a moral power that administrative or regulatory law doesn't. There's no real moral stigma attached to breach of regulation. But when you talk about a serious crime, then you start potentially influencing the way we think about damage to nature. And when we look at damage in armed conflict in particular, although we all know that nature suffers greatly during war, almost as a sort of automatic collateral effect of severe military action, it is still conceived of as collateral rather than as a primary form of harm. And we've been seeing in Ukraine the weaponization of that harm, whereas there's actually a deliberate use of the damage to the environment. But I think what perhaps is really important to think about here is that environmental damage has a different kind of scope to the immediate harm to humans and to infrastructure, upon which we understandably focus first. Why would we not? Harm to people, harm to actually the elements that keep our society going on a daily basis. But with the environmental harm, we're often seeing a sort of geographical scope, as we've just been hearing, a geographical scope that goes beyond the area of the conflict, but also a temporal scope that goes beyond a given time of conflict. As we've heard, there will be areas of Ukraine that will never be restored to how they would have been before. There's also, I think, one of the senses that I've had from the amazing conversations we've had with Ukrainians, and we've been dealing also with the prosecutor's office in Ukraine over time as well, is that actually the soil of Ukraine is a treasure. It's a really deep part of what Ukraine is and does in terms of culture and the soul of the country. So there are these several areas where we can see that environmental harm is absolutely fundamental. And interestingly, Ukraine is one of the few countries that actually does have some provision in its domestic law to deal with ecocide. And ironically, it's actually some of the ex-Soviet countries that do have this in their penal codes because of the sort of timing of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the evolution of individual penal codes, and the time of the drafting, interestingly, of the Rome Statute, where there was originally a clause that could have covered ecocide. Those things coincide, and so we see that happening. And I know there are some cases beginning to be taken in Ukraine with Ukrainian law. But I think one of the things that is really important to sort of clock here, and it's actually quite difficult for us, I have to admit, it's quite difficult for us as an organisation, because the worse incidents that happen in the world, the more people listen to what we're saying about how important it is that we set these outer parameters. So, for example, when this awful destruction of the Kakhovka Dam happened last June, we sort of sit in this place of, oh my God, this is absolutely horrific. And, Europe's reeling with the scale of this disaster. And at the same time, our phones are ringing, everything's beeping, going, can you tell us about ecocide? What's all this about ecocide? And we're like, wow, people are really listening now. And so there's this extraordinary sort of weird, bittersweet kind of edge that we sit on with this topic. But Ukraine has been so important in this. And I'll finish with this. But Zelensky has talked about ecocide on a number of occasions, and particularly in relation to the destruction of the dam. And actually, the word itself has great power. And so, you know, having this topic come into the media and be spoken of and be used, you know, by a head of state about a very live, immediate situation is, I mean, it's tragically human, but we pay attention when things are right in front of us. And so it's made a huge difference to the conversation and really sort of brought to the fore the inadequacy of the, you know, the current legal provision, and Ukraine's been such a support in kind of moving that forward, both in the EU, at the Council of Europe, and you know, generally in terms of the global discussion.
Thank you. It's really good to hear that the tragic disaster caused by Russia that happened in Ukraine last year has actually helped to draw attention to this legal debate on ecocide. I'm just wondering, where do we stand now legally? Has the precedent been set? Does Kakhovka have a chance of becoming that legal precedent that will allow us to define ecocide for the International Criminal Court?
I think it's made a very concrete difference, actually. And just in terms of very, very briefly, the kind of key recent milestones. I mean, interestingly, the discussion was brought back onto the diplomatic stage by another victim country, but this time of climate, and that's Vanuatu, the Pacific Island state of Vanuatu, who called on the International Criminal Court's member states to consider adding ecocide. That was in 2019. In 2021, a definition of ecocide was proposed into the world by a panel convened by our foundation, and that definition has catalyzed conversations all across the globe. What we have seen recently, and this was very, I think, particularly driven by the Ukraine situation and the Kakhovka situation, is that the EU, and actually the final vote on this was this week, with the European Council, the EU has now adopted a revised environmental crimes directive that includes a new, what they're calling a qualified offence, which effectively addresses conduct that they're calling comparable to ecocide. So it's not, in a sense, the fully fledged ecocide that we would perhaps advocate at the International Criminal Court, but it's a very big step in the right direction. In a sense, it's ecocide in all but name, and it covers a very wide range of crimes and creates a really serious aggravating factor that lifts it into more severe penalties and more seriousness. And that brings me back to my original point about the cultural thing, which is that what's so important here is the fact that we currently don't take environmental destruction seriously enough. And so alongside this very precise criminal aim, if you like, criminalizing ecocide, there's this kind of cultural or moral aim of creating a taboo around the mass destruction of nature. And I think that the Kakhovka Dam incident had, although in a sense it happened partway through those negotiations, I think it made a huge difference on how those member states, how seriously they took that text.
Well, it's really reassuring to hear that we are getting closer to actually holding ourselves accountable for the crimes we commit against nature. From justice to recovery, I'm now turning to Bart. While this existential fight in Ukraine keeps going on, we keep fighting, we are also keep recovering from the consequences of the fight. This recovery is not postponed into the indefinite future, it's actually already happening because people keep living in the country that is keep being bombed every night. And at Neo Eco Ukraine, you are pioneering circular economy methodologies. So basically, correct me if I'm wrong, you're using waste and recycling it into building materials. Could you tell us a bit more how that works? And probably you encounter some challenges. So I invite you to share your struggles.
Thank you for the question. It's a large question. I could easily speak a couple of hours on that, but I think that's not the purpose. We decided at Neo Eco to move rather early to Ukraine. So in May 22, we decided to establish Neo Eco Ukraine because we believed that circular economy could contribute to mitigate the impact of the war crimes that you spoke already before. Because we believe that when we speak about environmental damage and everything, we typically speak about the primary source of damage, which is perhaps war rubble. But how you are going to deal with it has a massive effect to the future generations. We talk about justice, but it's also, while waiting for that justice, how to minimize that impact and how to make the living conditions for Ukraine and Ukrainians suitable and as good as possible in this situation. So we decided to move quite early. We are a commercial company, so we are in a completely different setting to the way that we want to demonstrate how the situation can be something useful by demonstrating that how to build Ukraine better, which is becoming a slogan a little bit, how you do it in practical. So we decided very early to deal with a city north of Kiev, which is called Hostomel, next to the airport. 24th of February, the key target to take Kiev city. And around that airport, there are a couple of multi-store buildings that are completely destroyed, 50,000 tons of rubble. And if we would not interfere, what would have happened with that rubble? Just brought to the landfill in the best case, and in the worst case, in the field in the forest. That waste is containing hazardous waste. So that means that we would displace a problem from A to B, and most probably make the problem on location B more complicated to deal with for future generations. For us, it was a big challenge because war rubble, of course, is something unusual for a company in circular economy, because typically when you go to circular economy, you go to an existing building, you strip it by different materials, and then only the naked body you can deconstruct. So there's a whole methodology that exists within our company for many years, but war rubble is still something new, unfortunately. So we had to develop a new methodology to say, okay, how can we recycle, reuse that rubble in the most economical way, respecting EU legislation, respecting, of course, Ukrainian legislation, and using equipment which is there. Because, of course, there are people saying, yes, we want to clean rubble and we are going to build a factory of 10 million, 20 million, or whatever. That might happen perhaps in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know when. But we need now an action to mitigate that. So we started with that. And I always use a metaphor. It's like jumping from an airplane with a parachute that you need to create while you are jumped already out of the airplane.
Sounds very familiar, yeah.
So we developed a whole methodology, but at the end of the story of Hostomel, we were able to reuse and recycle 90% of the material. So for us, it was a surprising high number, because I think that we would have been satisfied with 75, more or less. But we arrived to the high number because we found in Ukraine a quite rich ecosystem of individuals, companies, people thinking along with us, who filled in parts of a puzzle to come to that high number. So it's not us which are the heroes, it's an assembly of people that are in Ukraine quite knowledgeable about environment. I don't say the whole Ukraine, but there are individuals, organizations quite knowledgeable about environmental things. And at the end, this 90% went mainly to making new concrete. So it's not just for the road construction, which is a generally used for rubble, but we were able to upgrade it to the highest standard of construction materials by which we are allowed to construct a 5-story building or to build a bridge with it. So it's a wonderful story that we started with. Of course, then down the road and going onwards, we also integrated social sustainability. Means now we use or we work together with war veterans in cleaning this rubble, in processing this war rubble, because we believe that, and now the projects, they are more in the south around the Mykolaiv region, where the devastation is significantly higher than in Kiev region. Kiev region, of course, we see the visuals of Bucha, Irpin on the physical destruction, but in the south, destruction is just significantly higher. We are talking about villages, settlements, where 80–90% is destroyed. So you cannot just do some plaster works and everything. And in those areas, there are war veterans that are suffering from traumatic psychological traumas. And we integrate them in our projects now because we believe that's the only way to rebuild that community too. Because otherwise we will leave these people behind. And then once Ukraine is rebuilt, we say, oh, we have 1 million people that have psychological problems. So we integrate that, and we finished the third project in Mykolaiv. We are now at a rate, surprisingly, 96%. So it becomes, let's say, an element. But to come back to the environmental aspect, This Build Better Ukraine should be more than a slogan, but should be really a part of policy. And it's very difficult for policymakers to make it very specific. How, as a policymaker in Ukraine, World Bank, European Union, how we can make it specific. And I want to give one example is that if we would reconstruct Ukraine with the same type of concrete that we use standardly, that would lead to a carbon emission additionally to the planet that is equivalent of 1 year of France's CO2 emission. So that is significant to global warming. That means on a global level about 0.5 to 0.6% only for the concrete, 0.5, 0.6% of the CO2 emissions worldwide. So it's important also, and I think that's the great challenge, but also the reason why we are in there as a company in Ukraine. Only innovation, only new technologies will be able to solve the problem. And I think Ukraine is for us as NeoEco a living laboratory where hands-on, on the scale that we never be able to do in France or another country. And we come across with a lot of brilliant people, with a lot of brilliant ideas in Ukraine. We should give them the means, the methodology, the trust. And we see these things happening. And we signed, for example, as a company on the 10th of January with the city of Kryvyi Rih, a memorandum of understanding. It's a city which stores 11.5 billion tons of industrial waste, is generating each year 100 million tons of industrial waste. But about 90% of that waste can be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So we don't need to excavate a lot of material from the subsoil of Ukraine to reconstruct Ukraine. Why not converting that industrial waste? We tested the materials according to EU standards, and they are fulfilling EU standards. But of course, it's a whole shift change to not look to waste as a problem, but to look waste as a source of inspiration, a source of way of reconstructing. And I believe if we will sit here together, hopefully in 10, 15 years, together again, that we will look back to this situation that you said, yeah, thanks to this, there was a lot of innovation that came out of it, from which European Union, other countries will get inspiration, will get copy of technology. And I'm sure what we will do as NeoEco, together with a lot of other companies, will become a standard of European Union. So I think that also people, what we see sometimes as NeoEco, that people are coming from other countries than Ukraine with the idea we should teach the Ukrainians how to do. And I think that's a wrong starting point. It is like, what is the problem? How can we help to solve the problem? And how can we jointly see what you have as assets? There are a lot of assets in Ukraine, a lot of knowledgeable people, a lot of creative people. And I believe that this symbiosis of what we know from the past in France and in other countries and what we learn in Ukraine will have a spillover effect also worldwide. And that's really the message that I want to convey also this evening is that, yes, there is ecocide, but we can do actions to mitigate it. We should allow innovation. We should also change policy, legal frameworks to allow that innovation and not, how to say, go with the flow of big industrial groups that are lobbying for products that are polluting a lot, that are so I discussed on concrete, that's one example. Another example is, for example, insulation materials. Ukraine is a grain basket of the world, but that industry is generating a lot of agro-waste as well. But that agro-waste can be perfectly used for insulating buildings, for reconstruction also of Ukraine. We have a pilot project in Chernihiv funded by the European Union to demonstrate how these old Soviet buildings can be converted now during the war into well-insulated buildings using the waste of the agro-industry. So instead of just burning that waste, which is the general practice in Ukraine for that waste, is to using for insulating right now. You ask me in the question, what is the challenge? I would say the challenge is mainly lobbying of big conglomerates, which has their products, their way of dealing with things, both in Ukraine and both abroad, which of course are not willing to give up their profitability or their way of doing business. And they, of course, they have an audience in different bodies like the Ukrainian government, in the Rada, the parliament, in the European Union as well. They have a bigger hearing, a bigger budget, a bigger capability of marketing and communicating. And of course, when you're coming in as NeoEco, as a pioneer perhaps with these ideas, you're an easy target. During the whole process, we came across to very difficult periods by which we are attacked by international organizations, we are attacked by local organizations, by government and everything, because of the pioneering aspect that we do. And people say, well, this is not the way to reconstruct Ukraine. And that's a big challenge to convince people, okay, yes, you have perhaps been worked together with these big conglomerates in Ukraine of construction industry and everything, but be open-minded and everything. And I would say it's not necessarily the Ukrainians as an individual, because there we get a lot of support, but it's more on the organization that is behind the economical machine that not only in Ukraine, we have the same problem in other countries, of course, but especially in Ukraine, it should be evolving much faster in order to say, okay, there are new methodologies, we need to give them a chance, let's give them a pilot authorization to do pilot projects and then evaluate and not say, well, you first need to test your material for 10 years and only then perhaps we will. So there is a lot of aspects in it, but I would say generally speaking, Ukrainian authorities are more and more adopting legislation that allows to experiment in the positive sense of word with new methodologies, which might inspire future EU legislation even, I say.
That's quite hopeful, yeah.
So I think that the key challenge is to convince people on a day-to-day basis, mainly in organizations that defend economical interests. But as NeoEco, I can only say that we are thankful and grateful that we can be part of the journey of reconstruction. Of course, we hope that we would never have to go to Ukraine for that reason. But I think now the situation is there. Let's make the best out of it. And let's try to minimize the impact of that environmental consequences
Definitely.
of that Russian aggression. Because when it will be paid back, I think we cannot wait till that time to reconstruct Ukraine. So let's do it now the best way, and with all together forward.
Ukraine, the land of opportunities. Join us on this journey of recovery and regeneration, and it will pay back. I have 1,000 questions, but I'm also conscious that our audience wants to join the discussion. So I will collect 2-3 questions at a time. There is a gentleman at the back whose hand was first. Yes?
Hi. Hi. My question is with regards to the ecocide aspect, which Africa as a continent, India as a country, and many other countries surrounding it have been a victim of, this mass deforestation. And then in the last few years, because my interest is in supply chains, so I like to look at where all these products come from. And I always end up in some mine in some country somewhere. The issue that we've suffered in India and Africa has been that, yes, there is that fossil fuels aspect, but then this green transition, and there's this misbelief that the green transition is fossil fuel free. But fossil fuels still need to be burned for the whole life cycle for extracting these resources. So my question is, when I was looking at the mineral resources for Ukraine, all the mineral resources, bar the timber and maybe some other extractives, other materials, they're all fundamental for the Green New Deal. So my question is, and this is something I would never want, and I don't want it for Ukraine, I don't want it for India, or even Africa, or even Congo. My question is, this path to going green, and the devastation that has happened for Congo for 30 years, people in Africa have been saying, hold on, our countries are being devastated, so your Green New Deal can progress. For the Green New Deal to progress and get resources from other countries, people have to decide. Do we want progress for Ukraine to rebuild and reforest that country? Or do we want to go down the green path, and it's going to be a nefarious path where we are going to have to end up having to deforest and strip mine the whole country? And with regards to the rebuilding of the country, I'd just like to drop this in. Way before Russia invaded Ukraine, BlackRock, the largest hedge fund, had already bagged the multi-trillion-dollar contract for rebuilding Ukraine. That's just something for everyone to think about. Why would that have happened? But my question is, to go green, is Ukraine going to be another country that's going to be in the basket for strip mining and deforesting so we can go green? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Please, yes.
My question is regarding the water pollution that is happening. Some of the global leaders are very much looking forward to support Ukraine, can there not be decentralized wastewater treatment systems supplied to Ukrainians there, so that, or portable toilets, so that they can avoid the huge loads that is going into the existing sewage treatment works, as you mentioned, so that decentralized way of treatment will lessen the impact of pollution there. Also, you mentioned that there is no such credible data available how much amount of pollution is happening. So can the Ukrainians who are here in UK or in any other European countries be trained in the water quality testing, wastewater quality testing, send them back, get the data, let them return back, and the new framework can be done so that they can lessen the impact. So some intelligence is required. This is called water intelligence. Some skill needs to be trained. And also there is Earth observation satellites, which is in the testing phase. I think some of the universities in Australia who I know are looking forward to test it. So why not utilize this as an opportunity?
Thank you. I'll direct the first question to Anna. The Green Deal and deforestation and the dangers embedded in this deal. How you, as the expert in sustainable reconstruction, would respond to that?
About being an expert, you know, it's always like, now Ukrainians have to be experts in everything. Sometimes I feel... it's a good question, I mean, from the perspective of that, yeah, indeed, Ukraine has lots of resources, and of course, even being an agriculture country, you know how much Ukraine is exporting abroad. I think we are conscious that we don't want to be also the raw material exporter, especially when we are thinking not just about rebuilding buildings or infrastructure, we have to think about rebuilding the whole economy. Because Russia is not just targeting, you know, people or buildings. They want to make sure that Ukrainian economy collapses. That's why they also target energy system, right? It's all connected. So as our big industrial capacities, well, think of Mariupol, they were destroyed. So we have to rethink actually what our economy would be looking like. And I think it makes total sense that Ukraine, that is now moving toward the EU, it's interesting to say it in the UK, well, we have to be looking for ways to actually be doing things together. And I think Bart's examples were also great, that Ukraine should indeed not be seen as a resource base, but actually a partner, a future member state, with production, not just of raw materials, but actually being upper in the value chains, right? And this is the same that African countries are raising, same kind of issues. We don't want to be just producing raw materials, shipping them abroad. We want to be actually producing equipment, appliances, and so on, and have more jobs. So I think this is what we're discussing. And if you hear our government saying Ukraine wants to be the green hub of Europe, I think it's somewhere there, around the lines. And also, I just want to say one word, because there was about water and decentralization, and I think this is the resilience. We have to be resilient now a lot. So when we talk about building back better, rebuilding now, and so on, it's a lot about decentralizing actually everything to the extent possible. So, because we know that a thermal power plant can be shelled, a hydro dam, you know, can be shelled, but if you take lots of renewable installations all over the place, with you know, batteries in the school here and there, with a small production of biogas and so on, you cannot that easily, you know, actually kill in the system. So I would totally agree with it. It is a very, very good approach, and we are still thinking about, and Bart said it very well, kind of seeing, I noted it because seeing waste as a source of inspiration. It's easy to say, but hard to do in your mind, right? You have to actually change the mindset. So we are kind of, I think, slowly but surely trying to understand how to actually make it work. Hopefully it will happen quicker than later, but yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And I wonder if Maruka has something to add to this question of decentralized treatment of water pollution.
Yeah, and actually also this deforestation and mining question, because I think it's a very good question. And I come from the European Commission. I'm happy to be saying that something good comes out of the European Union, and you know that we are. I think it's a great opportunity for Ukraine, because Ukraine is entering one of the most responsible environmental governance systems on this planet, let me tell. As a Finn, we went to EU in 1995, and although we are a Nordic country without Soviet legacy, I mean, it has impacted our environment in so many ways, so it's going to be a huge change. But even before that, EU has also regulations, upcoming regulations also on deforestation, the so-called EUDR regulation, because we don't want to be importing things from third countries which are not sustainably produced. So even before Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union and adopts the EU legislation, EUDR will apply to Ukraine. And it's very, very important, because before the war, 40% of Ukrainian timber, which was exported to the European Union, was illegally cut or sold. So there is some help coming. Then the CRM, this critical raw materials issue and the whole green transition issue, it's so complicated. And I have to say that I'm really concerned, and not only about Ukraine, I'm also concerned about Finland. We have, in the northern Finland, in the eastern Finland, we have quite some deposits of these rare earth metals and materials which are needed for the green transition. And already now we have a huge conflict up north, where we have the only aboriginal population of Europe, which is the Sami people. And it's the same for Sweden and Norway. I mean, these people are so concerned, and for a good reason. So it's, I don't have a good answer for you, but I'm just saying that you are flagging a very important thing. And this will also be important for Ukraine, because critical raw materials are one of the issues which have especially been raised as the driving economic forces of Ukraine's recovery. So, yeah. And concerning this water question, I fully agree with what Anna said. I think we are going to need different kinds of solutions. Also, what is good with the centralized wastewater treatment plants is that we can put a lot of very effective technology there. And then in big cities, for example, we can reduce a lot of pollutants coming to water courses. So there we really should have the top-notch technologies in use. But then, especially in Ukraine, where you have a lot of smaller villages and smaller places, of course we are going to need also these small-scale solutions and for the treatment. So I think we need both.
It's a mix, yeah.
It's a mix. Yeah. We need both of them. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, we will have to ask the next person. Please make your question really short. Gentleman at the back, and I want to hear from a lady, please. Be brave. Radical courage is the theme of the year.
Is it working? Richard Perry. We live in a world where diplomats...
Could you speak
We live in a world of diplomats, and I used to be one, and leaders who are playing chess with the world. They see the world as a game of chess. They are quite happy to sacrifice the pawn of something in Ukraine for the sake...
Microphone, please.
So my question is, how do you get these people to wake up and actually do something now? Because we run the risk of this being a very interesting academic exercise, and I'm my background is about taking action, and we are being far too diplomatic with things. So I want to know, how do we get these people to act?
Thank you for your question. And another one from the audience? Yeah, of course. Me. Take that go as well.
Sasha, you wanted a lady, so I thought I'd better put my...
I'm very grateful.
Tammy Evans, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So my question perhaps is more to Jojo. Prosecuting ecocide in Ukraine, it's not yet an international crime. And it's not specifically a crime in that sense in Ukrainian law or in Russian law. So what are the steps to being able to prosecute ecocide in Ukraine when we get to that stage? Thank you very much.
We should, please, the last question.
My question is about making a link between Russian oil exports and the cost of reconstruction and environmental damage. What seems to me from the outside as the fairest and most practical solution to that is to close some of the loopholes which allow third countries to profit from basically laundering Russian oil. And my question is there any discussion about creating a peace and reconstruction fund in which countries that actually do that laundering have a general import duty imposed on their goods that pay towards that fund, which acts as a disincentive for Russia? It can be long-term finance. If that was legally put into the constitutions or the law of the countries in question, Russia would know that every missile that was dropped on Ukraine would have to be paid for over X number of years. And why isn't that robust financial tie that can both be an economic disincentive to war, pay for the construction and the environmental damage, being asked more directly and assertively? Doesn't need to be globally agreed, doesn't need to be passed by the United Nations. Why don't we take action in that pragmatic way?
I think the last question rhymes really well with the first one.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
How do we actually make people act accordingly with these convictions? Who would like to, sorry about that, who would like to answer this question?
I'm really happy to take
yes,
that one.
Please.
And it's interesting, and I also feel like when the gentleman there was saying, why don't we do this? I was thinking, well, ask the guy who spoke first. Interestingly, I think with the diplomatic action, again, I'm going to speak from the position of a kind of a success story in that way, because the ecocide initiative is moving very fast at the diplomatic level. And I'd say that one of the key reasons for that, and it may be a partial answer to your question, is that it's so precise and so specific that it doesn't encounter lots of resistance. So, we tend to steer clear of any kind of political pronouncements or side taking, because we're just trying to go for this one thing, criminalize the worst harms. And in fact, even in the case of Ukraine, we only joined the conversation when ecocide itself became part of the topic. So there's a way, and actually, interestingly, we're finding that we're actually getting access to and conversations with and momentum, at quite a high level diplomatically. So that's one thing I would respond to that with. And just briefly to respond to the lady there, obviously there's some provision in the Ukraine and indeed in Russian actually law, and that is being followed at present. There are some cases being prepared currently in Ukraine. Of course, once this becomes an international crime, and I think we're now kind of seeing a direction of travel legally that is going that way. So it is just a matter of time. Of course, there's an issue with retroactivity. It's not like you can then suddenly go back and say, right, you did this in Ukraine at X time, and therefore we're going to prosecute you, because that's just not the way that law works. But this, I would actually just like to highlight what's been so impressive to me around how Ukraine has addressed this, because I feel like there's a real political generosity in how Ukraine has been approaching, sort of pushing this idea of a standalone crime of ecocide, because obviously they know that you're not going to be able to go backwards. So this is actually, in a way, for me, it feels like Ukraine is saying, not just, we're the victims, you've got to help us out, but they're actually saying, we don't want to see anyone suffer the way we've suffered. We want to see this put in place so that there's some justiciability that currently isn't there, that will then actually be useful for the, for the whole world in the future. And I think that's actually super, super important. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. A short one.
To evade Russian oil sanctions, they've apparently created a grey fleet, allegedly using very old vessels that don't comply to international standards. Now, by enabling that, we're enabling their war machine to keep going. We're enabling the funds to supply that. Are we also enabling a potential ecological time bomb?
Mm-hmm. Who would like to cover that? Marilka?
Yeah, as a Finn, I can just say that yes.
Yes.
Yes,
what else can you say?
Yes.
It's nice to be in agreement.
Yeah, and that's one of the, after the full-scale war started, there were many sort of concerns we had with Russian environmental policies changing, not least what they are going to do with their wastewater management, and it all comes to the Baltic Sea. But this was for sure one of the greatest worries, and now it has materialized. And you know that the Baltic Sea is very shallow, it's very rocky, it's very difficult to navigate. We also have this very difficult winter navigation conditions because it's ice covered. So yeah, and with these kinds of ships, it's just a matter of time when something will happen. So it's really a good point to raise.
Thank you. Yes, please, Anna.
I just want to mention, because I feel like it should be mentioned. It was also connected to sanctions and who's going to be paying and how to rebuild Ukraine. I think Russia has to pay to rebuild Ukraine, right? This is correct. Not all of the world countries in the world. This is why when you hear using frozen Russian assets, we have to just say this is possible. I mean, I'll not be talking a lot about it, but there's a lot already written about that this is justice. This is like, we should make it work. Not just the percentage of the money that is kept somewhere, we have to actually have it working, because we are talking about hundreds of billions, and I mentioned you how much it would cost to rebuild Ukraine. It's kind of almost the same sums. And also, the ray of light. Sorry?
Much needed.
There were already precedents in the world, so this is, I think we have to be, again, I will not be going into details, just remember this, Russian frozen assets. And I just want to give you the ray of light, because I thought I should mention that. We're talking about Kakhovka Dam a lot today, and our wonderful environmentalists, environmental experts of Ukraine, they went to see how the dam looks like in autumn last year. And so the reservoir where the dam and the reservoir where there was lots of water, right? Everybody was saying first, all the government officials, there will be a desert there. It will be nothing. Everything would die. What we saw actually is that there is willow trees, 3 meters high, growing. There was a huge forest, one of the largest forests of the south of Ukraine, growing instead of this reservoir. The nature is coming back, and it's the nature that used to be there for centuries before it was built, because the Kakhovka Dam was built by the Soviets to tame the nature. So one of the best Ukrainian environmental experts, Oleksiy Vasylyuk, he says that if Ukraine, and I think this is just really like the powerful phrase that I just want to say. He says, if Ukraine decides to rebuild the dam, this will be an ecocide. Mm-hmm. Yep. Because it's so big, and you would basically, again, destroy what actually should be there. So this is why when we're talking about rebuilding Ukraine, we have to be rethinking Ukraine. We have to be thinking how we actually have to be living together with the nature. And this is why we have today's conversation too.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Yeah,
it's a positive note to end on. Let's remember that nature will always find the way if we leave it alone and defeat those who abuse it. Thank you to our fantastic speakers. Thank you to our amazing audience for all your intelligent questions and your engagement. thank you to all our partners for supporting us beautifully as the Ukrainian Institute London. We couldn't be happier to collaborate with all of you. And if you allow me, I would like to finish with a poem. I actually have to stand up to read it. It was my absolute honor to publish it in the London Ukrainian Review. It belongs to Katerina Mihalitsina, Ukrainian poet, who, after one of the bombings of Lviv, came to the site of bombing to help and paid attention to the trees that were standing around the actual place of the attack. And those trees were standing there naked without their leaves because the leaves were torn off by a blast wave. I will read her poem in Ukrainian and then in English in the translation of Hanna Leliev. Катерина Міхаліцина, свідки воєнних злочинів. У цій країні свідчать навіть дерева. Обіймай обережно, просить ясен о край дороги, тепер і ласкавість ранить. Рани довго болять, як опалі горіхи, зелені, мов липень, у якому розверзлася прірва, і її не здолати, шепоче горіх. Голий, голий. Я оглухла, говорить акація, завмирає навшпиньки, видивляється серпокрильців, бачить, але не чує. В мене опіки 3-го ступеня, стогне ялина. Тут все на світі дихає жаром, як розпечена паща дракона. Він мене поглинає. Яка я серед вас надто ціла, чому? Тихо каже свидина і заломлює листя, зсихається із середини від провини вцілілого. Пил клубочиться, припорошує сіль їхніх свідчень клубовинням мовчання. Хто нині почує дерева? Хто візьме їх за свідків до суду? And now in English, thanks to Hanna Leliev for her beautiful translation. Witnesses of war crimes. In this land, even trees bear witness. Please hug me gently, asks the ash tree on the side of the road. Now even gentleness hurts. Wounds ache for a long time like fallen nuts, green as July in which an abyss yawned, and you can't bridge it, whispers the walnut tree, stark naked. I'm deaf, says the acacia. It stands on tiptoe, motionless, watching for swifts. It sees them, but cannot hear. I have 3rd-degree burns, moans the fir tree. The world around me breathes heat, like the fiery maw of the dragon that devours me. And I'm too unscathed among you. Why? Says the dogwood tree softly, drooping its leaves, inwardly withered by a survivor's guilt. The dust swirls up. It shrouds the salt of their testimony in the billows of silence. Who will listen to these trees? Who will call them as witnesses in court? Thank you for being with us tonight. Let's keep listening. Let's give voice to the speechless victims of crimes against nature. Let's make sure that the perpetrators are held accountable. Thank you.